Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Susan Chekow-Lusignan, Director of Marketing and Public Program Development for the Friends and Foundation of the Rochester Public Library. Welcome to our spring series of Books Sandwiched In. We ask that you please silence your cell phones at this time. Our thanks go to those who help fund programs like these through FFRPL, the dedicated FFRPL committee members who curate and organize these events, our guest speakers and artists who so graciously share their time and talents with us, the library staff who help with our setup and production, and the thousands of people who attend each year. We are live streaming the formal portion of today's program to the library's YouTube channel. If you need to access the induction loop in the service in the auditorium, please adjust your hearing aid to the T switch. FFRPL raises funds, presents programs, supports special projects, helps to create specialized spaces, and purchases supplemental materials and equipment for the Rochester Public Library. We'd like to give you an example from each category today. FFRPL is having a fundraiser for the Evelyn Bailey Shoulders to Stand On Endowed Fund, which will help provide staff and resources at Central Library to preserve and share the history of Rochester's LGBTQ+ community through archival collections and programming. Love is love. We have a $10,000 matching grant for gifts received by March 31st. You can visit ffrpl.org for more information or to donate online. Of course, we present programs such as today's Book Sandwiched In review. FFRPL is also a founding sponsor of the annual Art of the Book and Paper exhibit. The deadline for entries for the next show is May 15th. Artists can complete their online entry at rockcitylibrary.org, and FFRPL is proud to help fund, present, and promote this project, now in its 13th year. FFRPL also helped fund the library's collaboration with RIT's industrial students who are assisting with the retrofit of the van for the Lyle Branch's new mobile library, a specialized space which will support the expansion of outreach services to Rochester residents. The mobile library is slated to begin operating this fall. And FFRPL purchased thousands of Eclipse glasses for Central Library and RPL City branches in preparation for the total eclipse on April 8th. Patrons at Central can receive up to two pairs of free Eclipse glasses per family with an MCLS library card, or you can sign up for a library card at the circulation desk. You can contact the branches for their distribution details. Thanks to donor support, FFRPL was able to purchase these supplemental materials. The library is an official Eclipse ambassador working with the Rochester Museum and Science Center to present Eclipse programming and to educate the community on the eclipse and eclipse safety. Visit rockcitylibrary.org for more information on related library programs. Today, we'll hear a review of All You Have to Do Is Call by Kerri Maher. Maher's novel is based on the true story of the Jane Collective, Chicago's women-led underground health clinic that offered reproductive counseling and safe, illegal abortions in the early 1970s. Our presenter is Andy Aline, an MD and Master of Public Health. As director of the Holkelman Center at URMC, Dr. Aline teaches, does research, and practices evidence-based community health. Please join me in welcoming him to our podium.
Thank you, Susan. It's a great pleasure to be here at the library today. I love the library. I use the library every day online with Libby and Hoopla, and I actually come here with some regularity because for some of my community health projects, I partner with the Children's Center and Tanya Bergen upstairs in the Children's Library. As was said, I'm an expert in public health, a little bit in public health history, but more on things like the 1918 flu pandemic, not so much on abortion history. So rather than bringing a bunch of slides with statistics about abortion history around the world, I've brought with me Dr. Rachel Phelps, who is a walking encyclopedia on this topic. She is an abortion provider here in Rochester, Planned Parenthood, has been for 25 years. She was for many years the medical director of the regional Planned Parenthood, and she has traveled around the world learning about abortion, including in places where it's illegal. She has a lot of experience talking about this difficult topic, including at one point there was a feature in the New York Times Magazine about the new abortion providers, and she was highlighted in there. And so we're very fortunate to have her expertise. I am here as sort of a neutral party who read the book. And so what we're planning on doing is that I will read some excerpts from the book, and you will hear her comments about that. Does that sound good?
And we're very excited for the Q&A part, because I feel like this is a topic that's really, really important. That is, you know, having the abortions are incredibly common, but stigmatized, and nobody talks about it. And obviously that's become even more complicated now with the situation we're in legally. How's that? Yes, okay. So I also feel like I'm really excited about the Q&A portion of today, because I feel like abortion is a topic that is incredibly common in people's lives, but something that we do not talk about because it's so stigmatized, and that's become even more complex and fraught with the current legal situation in the US. And so I'm really excited to also open it up to be able to answer whatever questions you have, because I think it's just really important to talk about.
All right. And then one little thing, a detail that was brought up that I want to mention before I forget about it is that this book is loosely based on the true story of the Janes, who were people who were doing abortions when abortion was illegal in Chicago. If you want the real story of the Janes, there's a documentary called The Janes on HBO that I would recommend to sort out sort of what was the real stuff that happened versus how they portray it in the book. Because as is often the case, real life is stranger than fiction.
Yes. It's an excellent documentary, and the women who were the actual Janes are still alive, and so they're interviewed, and it's incredibly fascinating.
All right. So I'm going to start with a page or so from the beginning of the book. Veronica traced her decision to start breaking rules back to the day she heard Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. speak on the radio about the complacency of good people, but there had been no cause to embrace in her tidy suburb of Park Forest, with those regular rows of grass and garages. She chafed at the sameness and longed for the color and irregularity of her Aunt Martha's life in Hyde Park. Aunt Martha, her mother's spinster sister, had taught high school chemistry for decades before getting promoted to an administrative position, and took her only niece to museums and outdoor jazz concerts and every restaurant with foreign food in the city. Veronica especially loved going to the Ethiopian restaurant, where they tore off pieces of a deliciously soft, sour bread and used it to scoop up bits of spicy foods that exploded in her mouth like delicious bombs, detonating a latent curiosity inside her. What was she doing, though, thinking about food at a time like this, when Siobhan was presumably lying on her back and trying not to cry or scream or vomit, while she didn't even know what? How was an abortion performed anyway? She had a very rudimentary knowledge of a dilation and curettage based on the description given by women in her consciousness-raising groups. There was a speculum, of course, and a chemical loosening of the cervix, then scraping and cramping. Very often there was too much poking and prodding, and always there was the sense of being horribly, emphatically alone. Occasionally, there was a request for extra payment, a tip, because being that kind of girl meant you knew how to please a man. I'll stop right there. It gives you kind of a flavor for the book.
Well, so there's a lot in there. So the first thing I think that's interesting about this, which is still, there's things that we're in a contrast of like what was true then and what is true now, and then things that were true then that are not true anymore. And so the first thing is, I think the way that they talk about the procedure, the way that the procedure was done in the 60s and 70s is very different than it is now, both in a medical setting, but even in the case of thinking about trying to do it illicitly, if you're not in a state where it's legal. So the first thing is like, say you're in New York State where abortion is still legal and accessible. We now have, the ability to do it with medications, and we also do not use sharp curettes anymore, which really truly was back in the 60s and 70s a sharp instrument that was like slowly scraping everything out, that was very painful, much higher risk of bleeding, much higher risk of complications, much higher risk of scarring, even in a skilled hand. Now we do the procedure with soft, flexible, skinny, straw-like tubes, a small syringe that creates quiet suction, and it takes 3 to 5 minutes. There is cramping because the uterus is going to contract, but it's not to the degree of what would be with something like a sharp curettage. So the procedures themselves are very different now, safer, easier, but I think the other thing that's really different from when you talk about illegal abortion or unsafe abortion in the 1960s and 70s to now is we have medications that can very safely do this procedure. And those medications can be procured online. And women really can, and this has been shown around the world in many settings where abortion is illegal, that women can self-manage abortion with medications and simple instructions very safely. And so that is a lot of what's going on right now in the US, is that people are procuring medications on the internet, and that's how they're getting access to abortion. I think the other piece of this, though, so that's how things are different. I think the way that things are the same is some of the allusion to the attitude of the types of people who have abortions and the way they should be treated. Because as it was in the 60s and 70s, as it is now, particularly in the public discourse, especially around Roe v. Wade being overturned, and even thinking about sort of what's going on in Alabama with IVF, there's this way of talking about women as women who are mothers, who have children, who are the good women who need IVF because they want to be parents. And then there's like the bad women who are selfish and just want to have sex without consequences and don't want children and don't care about children. And those are the women who have abortions. And it's really, really, really important to understand that is not true, that the majority of women having abortions in the US are mothers of young children. 60% of women having abortions are already mothers. The majority of my patients are mothers. It's the most common topic we talk about, their kids, their names, how old they are, their hopes and dreams for their children. And so as much as it's very clear, I think, that IVF is about wanting a family and wanting children and wanting to be a mother, abortion is just as much about caring about your family and wanting to be a good mother. It's just about wanting to be a good mother to the children you already have.
All right, I'm going to keep going from that same passage. Veronica had heard that this doctor, the one helping her friend right now, wasn't like that. But one could never be too sure with a back alley abortion, even if in point of fact she was sitting in a building with an elevator in a room with a fish tank, blindfolded so that she could never find these people or this place again. I swear to God, if I hear Shaban cry or yell, I'll take this damn thing off and kick my way through the door. Veronica felt her heart speed up with the possibility of it. Her breath shortened. Before her thoughts had a chance to spin more out of control, she heard a door open, and in seconds, the Italian woman was sitting Shaban next to Veronica again. Are you okay? I'm okay. There was clarity in her friend's voice again. Sit here a little while so we can monitor the bleeding, said the Italian woman. Thank you, said Shaban, sounding genuinely grateful. An antsy minute passed. Then Shaban asked, remind me when you and Doug and Kate head to the lake. Do. Shaban was the opposite of a woman who knew how to please a man, and Veronica felt proud to call her a friend.
So, again, I think one of the things that is particularly difficult when you have something, when you have a procedure, and what they're alluding to here too, when you have something that is illegal or illicit, it opens up much more so the risk of being mistreated, being sexually abused, which we know was common. When you're getting a procedure that's illegal from somebody that's maybe a doctor, may not be a doctor, may have medical training, may not have medical training, may know what they're doing, may not know what they're doing. You're taking that like physical risk, right? But then beyond that, you're in a position where, in a society that views women who need these services as sluts, whores, whatever sort of negative thing you want to say, and there's this sort of expectation or desire that you can treat them that way. And I think that whenever you have something that's illegal and illicit and stigmatized, it's going to attract two different kind of people, right? It's going to attract people who have evil intentions, who want to take advantage of that situation to be a predator on women who have no way to fight back, who need that procedure no matter what, and who can't go to the police. At the same time, I think it's really important to remember that that's not the only kind of people, especially, there's a lot of, and we're going to probably get into the men versus women piece, but I think it's really, really important to understand that that's not all that there was, that there was that space for that, and you're going to attract that, and it's going to be much more common. But at the same time, you're also going to attract people, particularly physicians who were doing this illegally, who were doing it, male physicians, because most physicians were male in the 60s and 70s, but physicians who were doing it specifically because they were watching women die from illegal abortions and unsafe abortions in the hospital. And that they knew that they could either help these women and risk their license, risk their lives, risk prison, and try to, and keep them safe, or they'd be watching them die, in a week in the hospital. And so it really, I think there's this dichotomy too of the types of people who chose to do this work. I think specifically we're talking about men. Obviously we're talking about women, it's a little bit different.
Yeah. So as you may have guessed from some of the names, the characters in this book are Catholics, Irish Catholics, and that's an important part of the point, because what is the influence of religion on this? What is the influence of their cultural upbringing on how they feel about contraception, how they feel about sex, how they feel about marriage, how they feel about abortion. And so there is, a range of attitudes about all of those among the characters. And so one of the characters is Patty, who's more traditional. And her friends who are, in her eyes, more radical, are trying to enlighten her about feminism and maybe get her to join with stuff. And so we have a little paragraph on that. "You sure I can't entice you to join the union?" Patty rolled her eyes at the mention of her friend's radical feminist club. The women of the Chicago Women's Liberation Union didn't shave their legs, and she'd heard that they were even proponents of abortion. Patty was all for birth control, despite what some of her more conservative friends at St. Thomas thought. For heaven's sake, preventing a pregnancy was certainly better than the alternative.
So a couple things. I think one thing that, and looking around the room based on people's age, a lot of the women in the room probably experienced this, but I think young people don't know that this was true, that in the 60s and even early 70s, women could not get access to birth control if they were not married.
I'm going to do that.
Oh, I'm going to do that. Oh, sorry, I'm not allowed to talk about that yet. Sorry, we'll get to that later. But let's talk about the religion piece then. Right. So, I think there's this idea too when we think about who has abortions. Like I already talked about, being a mother and already having children. I think there's this idea too that the people having abortions aren't religious, that they aren't conservative, that like your worldview prior to having an unintended pregnancy is going to somehow predict or determine what choice you make once you have an unintended pregnancy. And that could not be farther from the case. When you look at people having abortions in the US, first of all, let's talk about for a minute how common it is. So up until very recently, 1 out of 3 women had an abortion in the US at some point in their lifetime. Because there's been a significant increase in the use of more effective birth control, a lot because of the no-cost birth control benefit of the Affordable Care Act, unintended pregnancy rates have dropped, and so abortion rates have dropped, and so it's now 1 in 4. If we continue to have the same access to contraception going forward. If we lose that access to contraception because something happens to the Affordable Care Act, access to birth control, the no-cost birth control benefit, that's going to go back to where it was. But it's still incredibly common. But if you look at women having abortions, and you look at what religion they are, the distribution of religions among people having abortions, basically within 1 or 2 percentage points, matches the distribution of religions in the US. So about 25% of people having abortions are Catholic, about 13% are evangelical or born-again Christian, a large percentage are Protestant, another percentage are obviously not religious, but there really is, and even somebody sort of prior to having that unintended pregnancy, thoughts about abortion don't predict what somebody's going to choose. I see patients every week who come to me and say, like, I don't believe in abortion, my family doesn't believe in abortion, I'm against this, I think this is wrong, but my situation's different and I never really thought I'd be in this situation, you have to help me and I can't have a baby, right? And so, it's very easy to have ideas about what you would do because you also have this idea that you're never gonna find yourself in that situation. And so it's not until you find yourself in that situation, have to make that choice, that you really know what you're gonna do. Nobody can possibly know what choice they would make until they're in that specific circumstance. They just really can't. But I think that's a big misconception that somehow political party or religion or even being pro-life or pro-choice determines who has an abortion, and it doesn't.
All right, so getting on to the thing about access to contraception, in the next bit, we have a young university professor at the University of Chicago who has just moved from being at Berkeley, where it wasn't a problem to get the pill from the campus doctors, and now she's going to visit the campus OB-GYN at her new university, and she's hoping that it'll be the same, but she's not too sure what's going to happen, and starts off having a pretty unpleasant experience with just how the exam is going in and of itself, and then the doctor says, "You look perfectly healthy, but whenever a girl like you comes to see me, I think it's wise to run all the tests we can. Mustn't have syphilis running rampant on campus." "I don't have syphilis. It's common not to know you have it. And of course, there's also gonorrhea and chlamydia." "It's fine if you want to run those tests," said Margaret, though her heart was beating resentfully in her chest. "What I really came for was a prescription for the pill." He shook his head. "I'm sorry, that is strictly off limits for undergraduates." I'm an English professor. I got my PhD from UC Berkeley last year, so you could call me doctor. His eyes widened as he looked at her as if for the first time. She knew she didn't look that young. Had he really bothered looking at her at all before this moment? He cleared his throat. "Are you married? Engaged? We do things differently in Chicago than they do out west." She couldn't believe the appointment was unfolding this way. "Would you prefer I send my history professor boyfriend in here to ask for it himself? Like I had to have my dad co-sign on my credit card?" That won't be necessary."
Lovely. So I think there's a lot there too. So I think one of the most interesting things about that is the part where he is very quickly wanting to test her for every sexually transmitted disease there is known. So he's clearly acknowledging that she's sexually active or knows that she's sexually active or suspects that she's sexually active. Has no problems with that. But the minute we talk about birth control, oh, I might faint from the, impropriety. So I think like that sort of disconnect between, I think it's still very much alive now, not so much in medicine, but in the way that we think about and talk about reproductive health in the US. So like when you think particularly about how we think about and talk about like adolescent sexuality, there's this idea that if we acknowledge it or talk about it out loud or make condoms or contraception available, that it's going to make teens have sex, because before that they weren't thinking about it and it wasn't going to happen, right? And so there's this idea that like, well, you can't possibly make condoms more available, make birth control more available, make the morning after pill more available, because then the teens are going to start having sex in the street. Like as if they're like, well, I mean, I'm not going to do anything until I'm sure that I have everything protected, right? So there's this idea that we have this very sort of irrational and denial-based approach to reproductive health in the U.S. And that is why we have the highest unintended pregnancy rates of any country, any developed country. We have the highest teen pregnancy rates of any developed country, and not by like 30%, like 4, 5, 6 times higher than any country in Europe. The next two highest countries would be Canada and the UK, and we're 2 or 3 times higher than them. And not just and this is another thing I think is important, is that I think when people think about unintended pregnancy and they think about abortion, people think very much about teenagers. They think about that teenager who gets pregnant before they're ready to have a baby, because it's that idea that it's not the mothers who already have 2 or 3 young children, a child with autism, a child with disabilities, just lost their job. That's not who's having abortions, it's the teenagers. When teens are actually a very small percentage of who has unintended pregnancies in the US and who has abortions. Because what drives who has an abortion is unintended pregnancy rates. And so the first thing that's important to understand is that in the US, the highest rates of unintended pregnancy by age are in women who are 20 to 25. And so it follows that's the highest rate of abortions. The second highest rate of unintended pregnancies and therefore abortions is 25 to 30. The third highest is teens. So it's actually women in their 20s who have the highest rates of unintended pregnancies and the most abortions in the US. And part of that's just because they're sexually active through bigger parts of their lives, right, than teenagers. And so, I think there's like that piece of it. But again, this idea that, and for everybody, is that the reason we have such high unintended pregnancy rates in this country that are just out of proportion for any other country with the resources we have is because of the way that we deal with sexuality and reproductive health. That we don't want to talk about it, that we somehow feel like if we do anything preventative, if we make contraception more accessible, if we make condoms more accessible, if we make sex ed more accessible, if we talk about any of it, if we make abortions more accessible, that's going to make the unsafe sex happen, the unintended pregnancies happen, the STDs happen. When the sex is going to happen, how much sex is happening, right? Like if you look at teen pregnancy rates where we have much higher rates than the rest of the developed world, teens are still having sex at the same age. If you look at the average age that teens start having sex is about 17, and that's true across Europe, the US, Canada, UK. But what's different is the chance that that teen is going to have multiple partners, STDs, an unintended pregnancy, and abortion much higher in the US, because we don't want to talk about it and we don't want to offer the things that actually could make that safe.
All right. So Veronica, character we heard about in the beginning, the one who eats foreign foods and is open to ideas, she becomes an abortion provider. She becomes one of the leaders of the Jane Movement service. And so here somebody's asking her, well, how can you do that? You're not a doctor or whatever. And she says, depends on what you mean by qualifications. I don't have any medical training, but I hear you all are the first to admit you don't either, and that you learned to do it because all the doctors were men and unreliable. So sorry, that's not Veronica talking, that's somebody she's trying to recruit. Okay. So that Veronica says, that's partly true. Abortion is the only medical procedure any of us know how to perform, but as we like to say, it takes a vagina to know a vagina. Phyllis laughed. Veronica went on, and true, the doctors were men, and their fees were too high, and they made demands for a certain number of clients per week, and sometimes they took vacations without telling us. But the real reason we do it ourselves is because we are women. The people who come to us are women. And as you said, women want to be surrounded by others like them at a crucial moment like this in their lives.
Again, a lot there. So the first thing I would say about the gender piece is, I do think that women, being a female doctor, when I walk into the room, patients very, very often are like, oh my God, I'm so glad you're a woman. I mean, I do think for something like this, where people even today come in expecting to be judged, stigmatized, treated poorly. Like, I can't tell you how many times patients say to me, you all are so nice, I can't believe how nice you're being to me, because they expect to be treated badly, that they deserve to be punished, right? And so there's this idea, I think, that power dynamic between men and women, which obviously was much more extreme in the 60s and 70s, but still exists to some degree now, and then you have the power dynamic of physician-patient, escalates that. And so I do think that there's a comfort and safety and sort of feeling like that's less likely to happen with a female provider. And this is like in a clinical setting. Obviously, we've talked about all the other layers that can happen in a non-clinical setting, where that's, you're going to be much more scared of what that man may do to you in this vulnerable position where you have no recourse. But I do think that it's important to remember that, he's a doctor too, a good doctor is better than a bad doctor. And that, gender doesn't necessarily predict good doctor versus bad doctor or good provider versus bad provider. The other thing that I'm going to say, which I'm sure for those of you who read the book was probably a little bit shocking, is this idea that completely non-medical people could be doing this procedure safely. And that is absolutely true. It's even more true now with the way that we do the procedure now, because it's actually takes less technical skill and is safer when you're not using a sharp metal, instrument like they were doing back then. But I think one of the things that's very interesting about the Janes is, and about this procedure itself is, an abortion procedure is actually a very, very simple medical procedure. It is not that complicated. There's no cutting, there's no stitches. You need to know what you're doing. There's technique, but learning a single procedure for anybody, even a non-medical person, is about practice. It's about having good, skills with your hands. It's about taking care, and it's about being trained by somebody who knows what they're doing. And that's actually more important than anything else, because again, they're right. They're doing this very narrow procedure, which is different than being a doctor who has to ask you a medical history and try to make a diagnosis and try to figure out what's wrong with you and think about what medications to use or what labs to get. That's a much more complicated thing. And so it is completely reasonable to learn this procedure and be able to do it skillfully and safely, even if you're not a medical person.
So the plot moves on. The main conflict in the book is what will happen with the attitude of Patty, the conservative anti-abortion friend, when her runaway sister comes back, and surprise, surprise, I'll let you guess what happens. Okay, so skip into the end now. The author talks a bit about her inspiration for doing this book and why she deviated from the facts of the Janes. So I'll just talk quickly about that. And then people have been good about not jumping in and asking questions, but I think people can. I'm not sure how this usually works here.
Oh, we're gonna open up to questions after this. And she's the boss of the questions.
All right. When I first started researching this book in 2018, it was hard to imagine an illegal Planned Parenthood run entirely by women just like me who weren't doctors or nurses. Unfortunately, as I write these words in 2023, illegal reproductive health clinics look increasingly like something we have to imagine. Initially, it was also hard for me to imagine a time in a group of women for whom it was essential and natural to see abortion and motherhood in harmonious alignment with each other's. Mothers get and give abortions. And then she goes on to talking about things like third wave feminism and et cetera, et cetera. So I think we'll.
Yeah, great. So we'll open up to questions now. I'm happy to answer any question you have about the book, about abortion, about anything.